How's everyone feeling? Good. You all look beautiful, as always. I hope you enjoyed looking at the pictures of yourself last week. I just wanted to show you how beautiful you were all looking last week. A couple quick notes before we get started. I forgot to mention the food pantry is open after the service. And then also there were some questions about the bulletin. We wanted to try out something new last week, and we're still working on it, so we appreciate your feedback. And in the next several weeks, we'll be doing some adjustments and making sure that we make it right before we roll it out. But we wanted to let you know what we're doing with that, and we wanted to give you an opportunity to see what we've been working on. So thank you for your feedback last week. We have collected it, and we're making some adjustments. So now let's jump into week 4 of King if you're just joining us. This is a series that we started a few weeks ago called King, and it's swung by this premise, and that is that most of us don't really understand the idea when Jesus says what it means to be king. Unless some of us grew up in a monarchy, and there's really not many of those real monarchies around today, we really don't understand the whole idea of what it really means to be king. I mean, we live in a country where we get to decide who gets to decide. We love our privileges, but there's one thing that does for us when it comes to the Christian faith. It removes us from being able to understand what it means to really live a life serving a king. And so over the last several weeks, we've been talking about what does it mean that Jesus is king and what is the gospel. If you remember on week 1, we talked about the fact that Jesus allows us to follow him, or he calls us to follow him, and he's not giving us a requirement to behave before we can belong to him, that he simply says, follow me. Follow me. Remember Judas. Judas wasn't a guy who knew how to behave. He had a lot of things that his heart was attracted to. And so Jesus still calls him, and he still calls you and I to follow him, even though we don't always get it right. Even though we can't behave, he doesn't say you have to behave before you can belong. And then we talked about the fact that Jesus is a king. Remember he said this, that my kingdom is not of this world, and the way that I do things is so out of this world. In fact, it's so out of this world that I don't use the normal means of ruling. I don't rule with rules, and I don't rule with fear. And so Jesus says, just follow me. I'm so out of the box that I don't really need to make you follow rules. If you just follow me, you'll find out that your life will change, that things will begin to happen if you just follow me. And then last week, we really unpacked what the gospel is. And we really began to understand exactly why we can believe in the reality of the resurrection. We can believe in the events that happen. Christianity is not just a story. It's not just things that were taught. It's an event that happened. Jesus got up from the grave, and that's the foundation of our faith. And so last week we talked about that. Now this week I want us to examine something because, the week after Easter, most preachers would tell you is usually the hardest week to preach because people understand and they anticipate and they come in for Easter and you know exactly what I'm going to say. Jesus is alive. You already know that. That's just built in. And then the next week, it's like, what's next? So Jesus is alive. Jesus got up from the grave. Yeah, preacher, I heard you last week. I saw you get up on the ladder. I saw you almost fall. And you talked about the fact that we can believe in the reality of the resurrection. Paul says that he saw him, that Peter saw him, that James saw him. Yeah, there are 500 people that saw him. We can believe in that. But what's next? I mean, yeah, we got that part down. We understand what it means to serve a risen king. We understand, but what's next? What do I do with my life? And so I want us to look at a story that I believe helps us to understand what it means to not just know the story, but to allow the story to be a part of our everyday life. Not just to know it as a good story to tell, but as something that actually changes our lives. Go to Luke chapter 24, and we're going to read quite a bit, but I want us to get this story, and then I'm going to share some things with you about some of my struggles that I had this week. Let's read Luke chapter 24. We'll start at verse 13, and we'll go all the way down to verse 32. And so check this out. Luke says this, that same day, 2 of Jesus' followers were walking to the village of Emmaus, 7 miles from Jerusalem. When Luke says that same day, he's referring to the same day that Jesus got up from the grave. This just happened. The same day that Jesus got up from the grave, the same day that the women went to the tomb, the same day that they ran back and told the men he's not there, the same day that John and Peter ran to the tomb and looked in the tomb and found out that Jesus wasn't there, this is the same day. And Luke says, check this story out. 2 of the followers of Jesus were walking to a village into Emmaus, 7 miles from Jerusalem. And as they walked along, they were talking about everything that had happened. As they talked and discussed these things, Jesus himself suddenly came and began walking with them. But God, check this out, kept them from recognizing him. Verse 17, he asked them, what are you discussing so intently as you walk along? And they stopped short, sadness written across their faces. And then one of them, Cleopas, replied, you must be the only person in Jerusalem who hasn't heard about all the things that have happened there these last few days. Jesus says, what things? The things that happened to Jesus, the man from Nazareth, they said. He was a prophet who did powerful miracles. And he was a mighty teacher in the eyes of God and all the people. But our leading priests and the other religious leaders handed him over to be condemned to death, and they crucified him. And we had hoped he was the Messiah who had come to rescue Israel. This all happened 3 days ago. Then some of the women from our group of his followers were at his tomb early this morning, and they came back with an amazing report. They said his body was missing. And they had seen angels who told them Jesus is alive. Some of our men ran out to see, and sure enough, his body was gone, just as the women had said. And then Jesus said to them, you foolish people. Jesus is a little bit upset, doesn't he? You find it so hard to believe all that the prophets wrote in the scriptures. Wasn't it clearly predicted that the Messiah would have to suffer all these things before entering into glory? And then Jesus took them through the writings of Moses and all the prophets, explaining from the scriptures the things concerning himself. And by this time, they were nearing Emmaus and the end of their journey, and Jesus acted as if he were going on. But they begged him, stay the night with us, since it is getting late. So he went home with them, and as they sat down to eat, he took the bread and blessed it. Then he broke it and gave it to them, and suddenly their eyes were opened, and they recognized him. And at that moment, he disappeared. And they said to each other, check this out, didn't our hearts burn within us as he talked with us on the road and explained the scriptures to us? Didn't we feel something when we walked with Jesus? Didn't it cause something to happen in our hearts when we walked with Jesus? Here's kind of my struggle. And if we can just have a conversation, is that all right this morning? Can we just have a conversation? So let me give you some sermonic and authenticity and some transparency. The last couple of weeks have been really tough for me. You ever had one of those weeks where your faith is kind of beat up, and you're praying and you're doing all that you can, and it feels like, you know what, God, I'm just not really feeling this whole thing. There's something about this situation. There's something about this family situation. There's something about this situation on the job, and I know that Jesus is alive, but come on, can we be real this morning? Sometimes we have those moments where our faith just takes a shot. And so here is Cleopas, and it doesn't really say who the other person was. And so Cleopas, who, by the way, most people think was actually the brother of Joseph, Jesus' father. And so they're walking down this road, he and this other person, and they're really at a place in their life, and they're on this journey where things feel hopeless. Like we knew that this guy was the one. We knew that Jesus was the Messiah. This was our king. He was going to rescue Israel, and then all of a sudden their faith takes a hit. Man, we followed this guy, and we watched him do miracles, and we watched him. He even raised Lazarus from the dead. We watched him. He walked on water. You remember that time where he took that fish and those loaves and he multiplied, and we had fish sandwiches? You remember that? And then all of a sudden, things became hopeless. And in an instant, they were struggling with the same things that you and I struggle. We know that Jesus is king, but what happens when it feels like and it appears as though Jesus has left the building? What does it feel like when I know that Jesus is king and I know that he is who he says he is, but I'm on this journey and it feels like he left me? It feels like life is hopeless. Come on, let's be real this morning. There are times in life where even though I know who Jesus is, I come down this journey of life and it feels hopeless. That's where they were. Yeah, we celebrated last week and things were great and the house was full, but then I had to go to work on Monday. Yeah, we danced and we took pictures and everybody was in their Sunday best and we celebrated the resurrection. Jesus is alive, but then I got to go back to work. I got to go back and face that situation that I've been dealing with all week long. And yes, I understand who he is, but somehow there are points in our life, come on, let's be real, where it feels like Jesus is missing. And so now you have two followers of Jesus who had dedicated their lives to following him, to understanding who he was, and they're traveling down this road to Emmaus, 7 miles from Jerusalem, and Luke says that there was sadness on their faces. And they were discussing all the things that had happened. They were discussing all that had transpired in Jerusalem. They were discussing the fact that the man that we followed, that we knew was king, they hung him on a cross, and they killed him. We were there. We saw it. He was dead. And they put him in the ground. And this is a long walk back home. It was a long journey, feeling abandoned. And haven't you been in the place in your life, in your faith? Yeah, Easter's over, and now we have to deal with the fact that life is still happening, that things are still going on in my house, things are still going on with my finances, and somehow it feels like a long journey back. And they were walking down this road, and they felt as though it was all over. And then they began to discuss the fact that some people even say that Jesus is not dead. And there's a discussion about the fact that some people say that the tomb was empty. And they began to discuss, and they began to retell the story, probably debating some of the facts, probably discussing some of the facts, and they began to retell the story of how someone else has told them that Jesus is not dead, that there's a resurrection that has taken place. And here's where if I can be honest with you, if we can have a moment of honesty, here's where I really struggle. Sometimes you take a text and you say, we're going to preach that, and then you read it and you're like, why did I choose that? Because can I tell you where I struggle, just like they struggle? Can I tell you where I struggle? Check this out. Verse 16, and he says this. He says, but God, check out what Luke says, kept them from recognizing Jesus. Come on, God, that don't even seem fair. I mean, all of our hopes have been crushed. We committed our lives to following Jesus, and now they brought him in on trumped-up charges. They hung him up on a cross. They brutalized him. They killed him. We buried him. And then here he is walking down the road with us, and you're stopping us from recognizing him. Come on, God, that doesn't seem right. Maybe it's just me, but that messed me up. Maybe I'm just being transparent, but as I'm reading, I'm saying, God, why would it seem like you're resisting the opportunity to show them Jesus? Why, God, does it feel like in my life I can't recognize Jesus? Why does it feel like, God, at work, and I'm trying to do my best, and I've dedicated, I know he's the king, but why does it feel like I just can't recognize Jesus working on my job? Why is that? Yeah, Easter's over. I know he's the king, but I got to go back to work. I got to go back to my family. I got to go back to my marriage. And here's what I struggle with. Come on, get with me. God, I sometimes feel like I can't see Jesus. And I don't know about you, but that messed with me. That here I am on the most hopeless journey of my life. Cleopas and his fellow disciple, we're on the most hopeless journey of our life, and here's Jesus who shows up, and we can't even see him. Luke says it was God who stopped them from recognizing who he was. And here's what I think. Here's why I think that this is super important for it to not just be a story. Because it appears as though that God is resisting something. It appears as though that God is resisting something. It appears as though that God doesn't want them to recognize Jesus. And here's what I think. I think when the resurrection has been reduced to just another story to tell, it's going to be hard to recognize Jesus. And maybe the thing that we need to move from last week to this week and from our everyday life is moving from the resurrection story just being another story to tell. Did you notice that as they were walking down the road, Luke says that they were just talking about what happened? See, when I grew up, we had this phrase this phrase that said, don't talk about it, be about it. And maybe part of the issue is that for thousands of years in the Christian movement, we have reduced the resurrection to just another story to talk about. Maybe some of the reason why God resists is because maybe in some ways, watch this, God resents the fact that he gave his son on a cross to die for our sins, and it has become just another story. Maybe God resists, and maybe some of the reason why God struggled with that is because I gave my son to die on a cross, and what you've done with it is you've made it just another story to discuss. And isn't it hard to recognize Jesus working in our midst when what he has done for us just becomes another story? I mean, isn't it difficult when we come in on Easter Sunday and we celebrate and the preacher tells the story, Jesus is alive, and then I go to work and I live as though it's just another story? And there's a lot of implications to that. Because God seems to resist, and in a strange way seems to resent the fact that I come in on one week and celebrate that his son got up, and then I live the rest of the week as though it is just another story. Maybe God resents the fact that I gave my son to die for you. This is my child, and in order for you to be right with me, I would rather give up my son than to give up on you. And then somehow throughout the course of our walk, we've made it just another story. And hasn't the church been very good about just talking about what Jesus has done? I mean, haven't we in some ways, come on, let's be real, this is a moment of honesty, haven't we in some ways reduced the reality of a resurrection to another story to talk about, and in some churches it's just something to debate the details? I mean, come on, we fight over everything from who should be doing this part of ministry to what part of the Bible, what translation we should be using, and maybe God is saying it has to be more than just something to discuss. It has to be more than just another story to tell. Cleopas and his friend were walking down the road, just talking, just discussing, maybe just debating. And maybe for you and I, in some places in our life, it has been reduced to just another story. Maybe in our theological circles, and we have gotten so smart in the Christian movement, people like me have degrees, and we discuss, and we debate, and we talk about, and God is saying, there's something about that I resist, and if it's just another story to you, you're going to be hard-pressed to recognize Jesus. If it is just something to talk about, if it has no implications in your life, if it does nothing for you, then you're going to be hard-pressed to recognize Jesus working in your midst. It cannot be just another story. And that can I be honest with you? That messed with me. You know why? Can I get real with you? Can I bow down your lane? Can I drink your Kool-Aid? Because I realized the moments in my life where it's difficult for me to recognize that Jesus is walking with me are the moments where I have to be honest and say, I've reduced his resurrection to just a story. And maybe the reason why it's hard to recognize Jesus in my marriage, or maybe the reason it's hard to recognize that Jesus is walking with me down this path of grief, or maybe the reason why it's hard to recognize that Jesus is still working on my job despite how it feels. Maybe the reason why it's hard to recognize Jesus is because it's just something you talk about. And maybe Jesus is saying that it's not about talking the talk. It's about walking the walk. And you notice that Jesus shows up on this road of hopelessness and he begins to walk with them. Remember we said this a couple of weeks ago, that Christianity was never designed to be a religion. It was always about a relationship. And maybe the fact that Jesus shows up to walk lets us know that Jesus walks because that's how Jesus works. That it cannot just be another good story to tell. It cannot be something that has no implications in my life, in my marriage, in my finances, on the job, with my children, how I relate to people. The resurrection has to become more than just a story to tell. We have to recognize that part of moving from the Easter story is learning how to walk with the King. Because Jesus walks, because that's how Jesus works. If it was just about another good story to tell, then we would be just like every other religious movement that has ever hit the face of the earth. If it was just about some good stories to tell and some good principles to live by, then we would be no more than any other religion. If it was just about the fact that we have some good things and some good stories to tell people, and Jesus did this and Jesus did that and Jesus taught this, if it was just that, then what makes us different? Here's what makes us different. Jesus walks. He walks with me and he walks with you. And Jesus walks because just the way that Jesus works. He wants to be a part of our everyday lives. It cannot be just another story. And maybe there's something about that God resists. Maybe the reason why they couldn't recognize Jesus is because from that moment it was just talk. Can I just get personal with you? Maybe some of the reason why you're unable to recognize Jesus working. Maybe some of the reason why in whatever area of your life, I know this is tough, but let's get real this morning. Maybe some of the reasons why it's hard for you to recognize Jesus is because maybe in that area of your life, the resurrection has been reduced to just another story. And maybe somehow God is resisting that. And maybe on some level, God even resents that what you've done with what I've done for you has made it just another story. And there are areas of our lives, self-included, where the reality of the resurrection must become a means for learning how to walk with Jesus. It's not enough just to come on Sundays and hear somebody else talk about Jesus. It's not enough to just talk about it. It's not enough just to be a subject to debate, or it's not enough just to be a subject to discuss. Jesus walks because that's how he works. And maybe we move from the resurrection to actually walking and living with a King who has every intention of being in relationship with us. A King who momentarily abandoned his own throne in heaven, abandoned glory just so, watch this, so he could walk with you, so that he could walk with me. What am I saying? Christianity is a lifestyle. It must become who we are. It's not just something to do. It's not just something to discuss. It's not just another Bible study to attend. It's not just another song to sing. It's not just another sermon to preach. It's not just another Sunday notch on my belt. Jesus walks because that's how he works. That I move from it just being another story by learning how to live out what Jesus says. Watch what happens. Because I don't know what all that looks like for you, but here's a great place to start. Did you notice that when Jesus showed up and he began to walk with people and he began to walk with Cleopas and it transitioned from just another story to tell? Did you notice that the moment in which God opened their eyes is because two things happened? This is where you can start your walk. One, Jesus began to study and explain the scriptures to them. Some of us need to understand that the way that we walk with Jesus is that we give precedence to his word. That until we take seriously the call that the King has given us to understand and to study and to learn as much as we can and to pray about the scriptures and to really try authentically to do what Jesus says, then it will be hard-pressed to see Jesus. Because he doesn't work when it's just talk. He doesn't work when the resurrection becomes just another story. Jesus walks when we get in his word. And did you notice that as Jesus began to teach them the scriptures and they began to learn and they spent time in the Bible, and then it says that they were so impressed with what Jesus was teaching them that they invited Jesus into their home. Watch this. If you want Jesus to be a part of your sacred space, all those places that you don't allow God, get in his word. Study the Bible. And don't study it just as another set of good stories to live by or a set of fables and myths or things or principles. Jesus walks because that's how he works. Get in his word. And you know, the other thing that happens when we move from it just being another good story to tell, not only did we see Jesus begin to help them to understand the word, but then it says that they came to his house. Jesus went to the house with them, and they sat down. And then Luke says it's when they started breaking bread together that they recognized Jesus. Y'all gonna get tired of me saying this? But you can't do this by yourself. That because the foundation of Christianity is based on a relationship, don't you think that you would do better in your Christian walk if you develop relationships with people that you can study the word with and break bread with, and then somehow the places where you could not recognize Jesus, all of a sudden you begin to see Jesus working. Jesus walks because that's how he works. It is not just another story to tell. It is not just another Bible study. It is about learning how to walk with the King. Because there's something about the fact that God resists and even in some ways resents when living a life where the resurrection is just another story. It seems as though that God resists that. I gave up too much to give you my son just for it to be a story to talk about. He hung on the cross and died for our sins, not so we could just talk about it, so that we can live it out. There's a story, and I'll be done, of older lady who she asked this little girl one day at church. She says, "Well, how you doing, little girl? How are you feeling this morning?" Little girl says, "I'm feeling great. Glad to be here at church. I feel good." About 30 seconds pass by, and the older lady said to the little girl, she said, "Well, aren't you going to ask me how I'm doing?" Little girl said, "No, because I'm not interested." Here's the reality. Can we now be honest? When's the last time that you honestly asked yourself, how am I doing? Are you interested in how my marriage is doing, how my family's doing, how my faith is doing, or is it just another story? So, honestly speaking, shouldn't it make you as uncomfortable as it made me when you don't see Jesus? Shouldn't you be unsettled and uncomfortable with the fact that I know who he is, but yet there's some areas of my life where I can't recognize him? Shouldn't you be uncomfortable? So honestly speaking, when is the last time you recognized Jesus working in your family? Honestly speaking, I know I'm getting in your business, but honestly speaking, when is the last time you recognized Jesus working in the middle of the chaos at work? When is the last time you recognized Jesus working? Honestly speaking. When is the last time you recognized Jesus helping you to work out that stuff that's going on in your marriage that you don't even want to talk about? When is the last time you were able to recognize Jesus? When is the last time you were able to recognize Jesus in your financial situation? Yeah, I know it's tough, and I know that it's hard, and I know that maybe you're unemployed, but sometimes I believe the reason why we can't recognize Jesus is because the resurrection has not become a reality. It's just another story. So honestly speaking, are there areas of your life where you can't recognize Jesus? Because the reality is Jesus walks with us. And somehow, if we're honest with ourselves, the reason why we may not be able to recognize him is because we've reduced it to just another story to tell. Let's be honest. Honestly speaking, where don't I see Jesus? Can we be honest with one another? Let's take some time to reflect.